Rome is burning, and an emperor is building a palace. On the ashes of a ruined city, Nero raised the largest private residence the ancient world had ever seen, with artificial lakes, halls covered in gold, and a bronze statue, over 30 meters tall with his own face. A monument to the power of one man, but empires do not last. And when Nero fell, what to do with all that? The answer changed the history of architecture and revealed something about how power really works. Because what was built in place of the palace was not just a building. It was a message, a political machine disguised as entertainment, capable of gathering 50,000 people in one place, each one seated exactly where society said they belonged outside an amphitheater, inside an engineering feat that no one in the audience could see. Underground elevators, secret corridors, trapdoors that made lions and gladiators appear from nowhere, and a hidden passage that allowed the man, most powerful in the world, to move unseen through the crowd. How did the Romans build all of this in less than a decade without a hill to support the stands? What archaeologists found in the Colosseum sewers in 2022 that no one expected? And what happened to this monument after the spectacles ended? Before we answer, we need to go back to the year Rome burned. The year is 64 AD. Rome is burning. A devastating fire sweeps through the city for days. Entire neighborhoods disappear, temples, markets, homes reduced to ashes, and while the people lost everything, rumors spread through the streets. They said the emperor himself had ordered the fire, that he wanted space, that he had plans. The emperor was Nero, and the plans were real over the ruins of the city. That had just burned, Nero ordered. A palace, something unlike anything ever seen before. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a monumental complex with artificial lakes, private groves halls, decorated with gold gemstones and ivory. At the center of the complex, an artificial lake, and outside, a bronze statue, over 30 meters high, the Colossus of Zenodorus, depicting Nero with the features of the crowned sun, God. To build all this, Nero gathered around him the greatest artists and architects of his time: the painter Fabulus, the Greek caster Zenodorus, the architects Severus and Celer, as Professor Diana Klein observed. Of Yale University, it is truly remarkable that we have the names of so many of the artists and architects of Nero, and that can only attest to the fact that he must have gathered around him the greatest artists of his time, artists whose achievements were so exceptional that their names were preserved for posterity, at a time when very few artists and architects had their names recorded. But in 68 AD, Nero was forced to commit suicide. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, the damnation. Of memory, his portraits were to be destroyed, his buildings demolished, his name erased, and then began the chaos with no heirs. Rome entered political collapse immediately. In just 1 year, from 68 to 69 AD, the empire had 4 different emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally a general, coming from the east, Vespasian. Vespasian was different from the other 3, not because he was noble or his origins were relatively humble by imperial standards, but because he was extraordinarily intelligent, and because he had 2 sons to succeed him, Titus and Domitian. He knew that winning a civil war gave power but not legitimacy for that. He needed something more, and he found it in the east of the empire. His son Titus was sent to Judea in 70 AD. Titus destroyed Jerusalem, plundered the temple, and returned to Rome laden with spoils: the 7-branch candelabrum, the Ark of the Covenant, gold, silver, sacred objects. This conquest gave the Flavian dynasty what it needed: a foreign victory to justify its right to rule. And it was exactly with the money from that plunder that the Colosseum was built. The labor force, largely Jewish, the enslaved people of Judea. But Vespasian still had one problem to solve. The Domus Aurea was still there, the lake still existed. Nero's colossal statue was still standing with the tyrant's face looking. Over Rome, what to do with all of it? The answer was one of the most brilliant political gestures in ancient history. He ordered the Domus Aurea demolished. He ordered the lake drained, and in the exact place where Nero's private lake had stood, that supreme symbol Of imperial selfishness, he ordered the construction of a public amphitheater, open to all citizens of Rome. The message needed no words, as Professor Klein herself summarized what the Roman people wanted, more than anything else, was an amphitheater. They could go to a great amphitheater where 50,000 of them could gather and watch animal hunts and gladiator fights. There was no better way to win the favor of the Roman people than to build a building like that. It was propaganda, it was politics, it was architecture in the service of power. The construction began in 70 AD. But how exactly did the Romans raise in less than a decade? A building no civilization had ever attempted before, and what was hidden inside it that no spectator could see? Vespasian used money, plundered from Jerusalem and enslaved labor, to build Rome's greatest symbol. What do you think about that? The history of monuments changes when we know how they were built. The hidden engineering, the construction, began with a challenge no Roman engineer had faced before. There was no slope, there was no hill. There was nothing to support the stands. From the outside, all previous amphitheaters had been built. Against hillsides, the earth served as natural support. The Colosseum would be different. It had to support itself. In the middle of a flat valley where a lake once stood. The engineers solved that. With a precise combination of materials, the foundation was made of concrete, the external skeleton, and the facade of travertine blocks. The light stone of Tivoli, transported to Rome on carts, pulled by oxen and hoisted by wooden cranes, operated by hand, the secondary walls of volcanic tuff, the internal vaults again in concrete. On the second floor, the engineers introduced something that had never been used on a public scale before: the groin vault, formed by the intersection of two barrel vaults, an innovation so significant that it would become standard in Roman architecture from then on. The result was an oval building 189 meters long by 156 meters wide, with 4 stories rising nearly 50 meters high, the equivalent of a modern building, of 17 stories with room for 50,000 spectators. Built in approximately 8 years, but the most impressive, engineering was not in the walls. It was in what no one saw: the hierarchy carved in stone. On opening day in 80 AD, tens of thousands of Romans approached the Colosseum at the same time, and there was no chaos. The Colosseum was designed like a modern stadium, with 76 numbered arches at the entrance, each one indicating exactly which section the spectator should head to. The tesserae, a kind of ancient ticket, listed the arch, the row, and the seat. 29 of those numbers can still be seen today on the north side of the monument. Once inside the vomitoria, passageways and radial staircases spread throughout. The building allowed 50,000 people to move in an orderly way, entering and leaving in just a few minutes. And where each person sat said everything about who they were. The senators sat in the seats closest to the arena, the best angles, the greatest proximity to the spectacle just behind. Them the equestrians higher up, the common citizens, and at the top, the plebs with wooden seats, and the worst view in the amphitheater. The point of greatest honor was the imperial box, positioned on the minor axis of the amphitheater. With a privileged view of everything, admission was free, offered by the emperor as a gift to the people. But free did not mean equal. The Colosseum was Rome in miniature, the city's social hierarchy, reproduced with surgical precision on every stone step and above, covering part of the stands from Rome's scorching sun, a velarium, a gigantic awning operated by hundreds of sailors from the imperial fleet, who handled ropes and masts to extend and retract the structure. But while the audience settled into the stands, something far more complex was happening beneath their feet. You have just seen how the Colosseum was built above, but what was happening below in the corridors, the audience never saw, is where the story becomes disturbing. 28 elevators, 224 men working in sync in the darkness, a secret passage that allowed the emperor to move unseen. Among 50,000 people and archaeologists who 2,000 years later are still finding things no one expected in the sewers of this place. Part 2 is on the channel, and I am telling you, once you know what was happening beneath your feet, you will never look at the Colosseum the same way again.